The crack of a whip sliced through the hot New Mexico air, followed by a scream that sent birds scattering from nearby trees. Clara Winters crumpled to the dusty ground of Blackwell Ranch, her back burning as if touched by fire itself, her threadbare dress offering no protection against the brutal lashing. "Get up!" Vernon Blackwell bellowed, his face twisted with disgust as he towered over her fallen form. "I don't pay for weakness. 3 days you've been lagging behind the others." Clara tried to push herself up, her arms trembling under her own slight weight. At 20 years old, she should have been in the prime of her life, but months of near starvation and brutal labor had hollowed her cheeks and dulled the light in her once bright hazel eyes. "I'm sorry, Mr. Blackwell," she whispered, tasting blood where she'd bitten her lip to keep from crying out again. "The fever," he sneered, spitting into the dirt beside her head. "That's what all you Eastern girls say. Too delicate for honest work. Your debt ain't paying itself, girl." The summer of 1878 had been merciless in the New Mexico territory, the heat unrelenting even as September approached. Clara had arrived 3 months prior, answering an advertisement for respectable female workers at the Blackwell cattle operation. The promise of good wages to send back to her ailing mother in Boston had seemed like providence. Instead, she'd found herself trapped in a system of debt and cruelty, charged exorbitant prices for meager food and shelter, never able to get ahead. "Please," she breathed, finally managing to stand on unsteady legs. "I just need a day to recover." Vernon Blackwell's eyes narrowed as he coiled his whip. "You'll work until sundown like everyone else, and if you fall again, it'll be 10 lashes instead of 5. Clara bit back tears as she turned toward the wash house where she'd been scrubbing linens before her collapse. Each step was agony, the fresh wounds on her back pulling with every movement. Around her, the other workers, mostly Mexican laborers and women in similar desperate straits, kept their eyes down, unable to risk helping her. From the edge of the property, a pair of steel-blue eyes watched the scene unfold from beneath the shadow of a worn Stetson. Quentin Hayes sat atop his dun stallion, his weathered face revealing nothing of the cold anger building inside him. He'd come to negotiate a cattle purchase, not to witness a woman being whipped like an animal. His large, calloused hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the reins. Quentin had built his small ranch through years of honest labor, living simply and treating his few hands with fairness. At 32, the quiet cowboy had earned respect throughout the territory for his straight dealing and expert horsemanship. What he hadn't earned was a reputation for meddling in others' affairs, something that had kept him alive in a land where men killed over less than a sideways glance. But something about the woman's quiet dignity as she struggled to her feet stirred something inside him that he'd thought long buried. Nudging his horse forward, Quentin approached the main house where Vernon Blackwell now stood on the porch, barking orders at a stable boy. "Blackwell," Quentin called, his voice low but carrying. "Come to discuss that herd you're selling." Vernon's demeanor changed instantly, a wide smile breaking across his florid face. "Hayes, didn't expect you till tomorrow. Come on up, have a drink." Quentin dismounted with fluid grace, his tall frame unfolding as he tied his horse to the hitching post. "Hot day for pushing cattle," he remarked, climbing the steps with deliberate slowness, taking stock of the operation with experienced eyes. "Seems like your hands are working mighty hard." "Got to keep 'em busy," Vernon chuckled, pouring whiskey into 2 glasses. "Especially these Eastern girls. Think they can come out west and live off charity." Quentin accepted the glass but didn't drink. "That one you were disciplining, what'd she do?" Vernon waved dismissively. "Faking illness. They all try it eventually. She'll learn." "Didn't look like faking to me," Quentin said quietly. Looked like a girl about to drop from fever. The older rancher's eyes hardened. Didn't figure you for soft, Hayes. That girl owes me for her passage west, her room and board. She'll work it off like the rest or face the consequences. Quentin set his untouched whiskey down. Show me the cattle you're selling. For the next hour, Quentin inspected the herd, his mind only half on the business at hand. When they returned to finalize the deal, his gaze drifted to the wash-house where Clara was visibly struggling to keep working, her movements growing more uncoordinated as the afternoon wore on. "I'll take 30 head, Quentin finally said. "And the girl?" Vernon blinked in surprise. "What girl?" "The one you whipped. I'll take her debt too." A slow, lewd smile spread across Vernon's face. "Didn't think you were the type for female companionship, Hayes. Always kept to yourself." "Her debt," Quentin repeated firmly. "What does she owe?" Vernon named a sum nearly triple what the girl could possibly have accumulated. Quentin didn't flinch. "I'll give you the market price for the cattle and take her debt at that figure. You're getting more than fair value." After some haggling, Vernon agreed, too pleased with the cattle deal to quibble over a sickly worker. "She's not much use anyway. Take her before she infects the others." As the sun began its descent behind the mountains, Clara looked up in confusion when Vernon Blackwell approached with the tall stranger she'd noticed earlier. "Pack your things, girl," Vernon ordered. "Your debt's been purchased. You belong to Hayes now." Clara's heart sank as she stared at the imposing cowboy. His face revealed nothing, but she'd heard stories of girls sold off to remote ranches, never to be seen again. Still, it couldn't be worse than this place. Even death might be preferable to another day under Blackwell's whip. With trembling hands, she gathered her meager possessions, a hairbrush missing half its bristles, a faded photograph of her mother, and a single change of clothes, and followed the stranger to where his horse waited. "Can you ride?" Quentin asked, the first words he'd spoken directly to her. Clara nodded weakly, though in truth, she doubted her ability to stay upright. Seeing her sway on her feet, Quentin made a decision. In one smooth motion, he lifted her onto his horse, careful to avoid her injured back, then mounted behind her. "Rest against me if you need to," he said quietly as they rode away from Blackwell Ranch. "My place is about 2 hours from here." Clara sat rigid despite her exhaustion, unwilling to lean against this stranger who now owned her. But as they continued, the gentle rhythm of the horse combined with her fever made staying upright increasingly difficult. Eventually, her body betrayed her, and she slumped back against his solid chest. Instead of taking advantage, Quentin simply adjusted his arm to support her more securely. "Not much further," he murmured. Through fever-hazed eyes, Clara watched the landscape change as they rode higher into pine-covered foothills. When they finally arrived at a modest cabin nestled in a small valley, with corrals and a barn nearby, the sun had nearly set. "This is Hayes Ranch," Quentin said, dismounting before carefully helping her down. When her legs buckled, he caught her with gentle hands. "Steady now." He led her inside the cabin, which was surprisingly clean and orderly for a bachelor's dwelling. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and simple but sturdy furniture filled the main room. "You can have the bed," he said, gesturing to a door leading to a small bedroom. "I'll take the chair tonight." Clara stared at him in confusion. What do you want from me?" Quentin's expression softened slightly. "Right now, I want you to rest and get that fever down. There's clean water in the basin to wash up. I'll heat some food." Too exhausted to argue or question further, Clara retreated to the bedroom. She used the water to clean her face and hands, wincing as she tried to reach the lash marks on her back. A soft knock at the door startled her. "I have some salve for those wounds," Quentin said through the door. "And a clean shirt you can use as a nightgown." When she opened the door, he handed her the items without entering her space. "I'll leave some broth warming by the fire. Come out when you're ready or I can bring it in." Clara took the offerings with shaking hands. "Why are you doing this?" Quentin looked at her directly for the first time, his blue eyes meeting hers. "No one deserves to be treated like that. Get some rest, miss." "Clara," she supplied. "Clara Winters, Miss Winters. I'm Quentin Hayes." After he left, Clara applied the salve as best she could, tears flowing freely at the relief it brought to her burning skin. The shirt he'd provided was soft from many washings and hung to her knees. When she emerged, Quentin was sitting at a small table, pouring tea into 2 cups. "The broth should help," he said, indicating a bowl beside one of the cups. "It's just rabbit and some vegetables, but it's nourishing." Clara sat gingerly on the edge of the chair, eyeing him warily as she sipped the broth. It was the most flavorful thing she'd tasted in months, and she had to force herself not to gulp it down. "Mr. Hayes," she began hesitantly, "I need to understand my situation. You bought my debt," Quentin nodded, adding honey to his tea. "Blackwell won't be coming after you. Your debt's considered paid." "And what do I owe you now?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Nothing," he said simply. "When you're well enough, I can take you to town if you want to find passage east, or you can stay on here for a while, help with cooking and such if you're so inclined." "I could use the help, but it would be paid work." Clara stared at him in disbelief. "You don't expect anything else?" A flash of something, perhaps anger, perhaps sadness, crossed his features. "No, Miss Winters, I don't make a habit of taking advantage of women in desperate situations." For the first time in months, Clara felt something other than fear or despair. It wasn't quite hope, she was too cautious for that, but perhaps its distant cousin. "Thank you," she whispered. Later, as she lay in his bed while he settled in the chair by the fire, Clara listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the mountain night. Whatever tomorrow brought, at least for tonight, she was safe. The fever broke sometime before dawn. Clara woke to sunlight filtering through a small window, momentarily disoriented by the soft bed and clean sheets. The events of the previous day came rushing back, and she sat up cautiously, testing her strength. Her back still burned, but the fever fog had lifted from her mind. She could smell coffee and something cooking. Pulling on her tattered dress rather than continuing to wear Quentin's shirt, she ventured into the main room. Quentin stood at the stove, his back to her as he turned strips of bacon in a cast-iron pan. Without his hat, she could see his dark hair was streaked with early silver at the temples, though he couldn't be much past 30. "Morning," he said without turning. "Coffee's hot if you want some." "Thank you," Clara replied, pouring herself a cup from the pot on the stove. "How did you know I was awake?" A hint of a smile touched his lips. "Floorboards creak in different ways. You get used to listening when you live alone." He set a plate of bacon and eggs before her, then took his own seat across the small table. Clara ate slowly, savoring real food after months of thin gruel and hard bread at Blackwell's. "Your color's better," Quentin observed. "Fever's broken," Clara nodded. "Yes, I'm feeling much stronger." "Good. Your back needs tending, though. Those cuts could fester without proper care." Clara flushed. "I can manage. Mrs. Ortega from the neighboring ranch comes by to help with laundry once a week. She'll be here today. She can help you." Relief washed over Clara. The thought of this man, kind as he seemed, tending to her wounds was mortifying. "Mr. Hayes," she began carefully, "I appreciate your generosity, but I don't understand why you would help a stranger this way." Quentin sipped his coffee, considering his words. "My mother came west as a mail-order bride. The man who sent for her turned out to be cruel. She escaped with me when I was just a boy. We nearly starved before a rancher took us in, gave her honest work." His eyes met hers. I know what it means to need a safe harbor." The simple story, plainly told, revealed more about the quiet cowboy than hours of conversation might have. Clara nodded, understanding dawning. "What happened to your mother?" she asked softly. "Died of pneumonia when I was 16. The rancher who took us in taught me everything I know about cattle, left me enough to start this place when he passed. And you've been alone since then." Something flickered in his eyes. "By choice, Miss Winters. It's simpler that way." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Ortega, a stout Mexican woman in her 50s with a no-nonsense manner and kind eyes. Quentin excused himself to tend to his chores, leaving Clara in capable hands. Mrs. Ortega clucked sympathetically at the state of Clara's back. "That Blackwell ease on demonio," she muttered as she cleaned the wounds with gentle efficiency. "Senor Hayes, he is good man to rescue you." "You know him well?" Clara couldn't help asking as the woman applied fresh salve. Mrs. Ortega smiled. 10 years my family worked nearby. Senor Hayes, he helped my son when he break his leg, pay him full wages while he heal. Not many would do this." She wrapped clean bandages around Clara's torso, "but he is always alone, too much alone." By the time Quentin returned in the afternoon, Mrs. Ortega had helped Clara wash her hair and mend her dress, though it remained pitifully inadequate. "I've set some things out for you," Quentin said, placing a bundle on the table. "They belong to my mother. Might need taking in, but they'll serve until we can get you proper clothes." The bundle contained 2 simple dresses, undergarments, and a warm shawl, all dated in style but of good quality and meticulously preserved. Clara ran her fingers over the fabric, moved by the gesture. "I couldn't possibly. They're no use to anyone in that trunk," he interrupted. "Better they serve a purpose." That evening, wearing one of his mother's dresses that hung somewhat loosely on her frame, Clara insisted on cooking dinner despite his protests. The simple act of preparing a meal from the well-stocked pantry gave her a sense of normalcy she hadn't experienced since leaving Boston. As they ate the venison stew she'd prepared, Quentin seemed to relax slightly, the rigid set of his shoulders easing. "This is good," he said. "Been a while since I had a home-cooked meal that wasn't my own poor attempt." Clara smiled tentatively. "It's the least I can do. Mr. Hayes, I've been thinking about your offer, to stay and work. I would like to accept, at least until I can save enough to send for my mother or return east." Quentin studied her for a moment. "You sure you're strong enough? No rush to decide." "I'm stronger than I look," she said with quiet dignity. "And I need to work, to contribute. I'm not looking for charity." He nodded, understanding her pride. "Fair enough. When you're healed, we'll talk about duties and wages." He paused. "Your mother, she's still in Boston?" "Yes, she's been ill for some time. I came west to earn money for her care." Clara's voice caught. "I haven't been able to send anything. You can write to her tomorrow. Let her know you're safe. I'll make sure it gets posted." That night, as Clara lay in the bedroom while Quentin again took the chair by the fire, she felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. Not just gratitude, though that was certainly present, but something warmer. This quiet, solitary man had shown her more kindness in a day than she'd experienced in months. The next week passed in a gentle rhythm as Clara's strength returned. True to his word, Quentin made no demands beyond asking her to prepare meals when he returned from working with his small herd. He spent most daylight hours outside, giving her space to recover and become comfortable in his home. On her 4th day, feeling restless after being confined for so long, Clara ventured outside to explore the small ranch. The property nestled in a valley surrounded by pine-covered hills, with a clear stream running nearby. A vegetable garden, somewhat neglected but still productive, grew behind the cabin, As she knelt to pull weeds from around the tomato plants, she heard hoofbeats approaching. Looking up, she saw Quentin returning earlier than usual, leading a pretty bay mare behind his stallion. "Thought you might like to get some air," he explained, dismounting. "This is Penny. She's gentle, good for someone still getting their strength back." Clara approached the mare cautiously. "She's beautiful, but I'm not much of a rider." "Everyone in these parts needs to ride," Quentin said matter-of-factly. "I can teach you if you're willing." The next morning, after changing Clara's bandages, a task she could now manage herself with improving dexterity, Quentin gave her her first riding lesson. His teaching style was patient but firm, his instructions clear and practical. "Keep your back straight but not tense," he advised, standing beside Penny as Clara sat nervously in the saddle. "The horse can feel everything you're feeling. If you're scared, she'll be nervous too." Clara took a deep breath, consciously relaxing her shoulders. "Like this? Better," he nodded. "Now, let's walk the perimeter of the corral." By the end of the lesson, Clara had progressed from terrified stillness to cautious enjoyment, even managing a slow trot under Quentin's watchful eye. "You're a natural," he said as he helped her dismount, his hands strong and steady at her waist. For a brief moment, they stood close, his hands lingering perhaps a second longer than necessary. Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with exertion. "Thank you for your patience," she said, stepping back slightly. If Quentin noticed her flush, he gave no indication. "We'll practice again tomorrow, if your back isn't troubling you." Daily riding lessons became part of their routine, along with Clara taking over the cooking and gradually assuming other household duties as her strength returned. The neglected garden flourished under her care, and she found unexpected pleasure in the domestic tasks that had once seemed like burdens in her Boston home. At night, they would sometimes sit by the fire, Clara mending clothes or reading one of the few books Quentin owned, while he cleaned tack or worked on simple wood carvings, a hobby she discovered he pursued with the same quiet concentration he brought to all tasks. They spoke little during these evenings, but the silence was companionable rather than awkward. Occasionally, Clara would glance up to find Quentin watching her with an unreadable expression that made her heart beat faster. 2 weeks after her arrival, Quentin announced he needed to ride into town for supplies. "I'd like to come," Clara said immediately. "If that's all right." Quentin seemed hesitant. "It's a long ride and town can be rough." "My back is much better now and I've been practicing my riding," she reminded him. "Besides, I need a few things." She gestured at the altered dress she wore. "Your mother's clothes are lovely, but I should have something of my own." He nodded his agreement. "We'll leave at first light. It's best to handle business and be out before the saloons fill up." The town of Pine Creek was smaller than Clara had imagined, just a single dusty street lined with essential businesses. A general store, a saloon, a small hotel, the sheriff's office, and a handful of other establishments. As they rode in, Clara felt eyes upon her. A woman on horseback was common enough in the West, but a new face always drew attention in small communities. She sat straighter in the saddle, conscious of how she appeared next to the respected rancher. At the general store, Clara selected fabric, thread, and other necessities while Quentin arranged for his larger supplies to be delivered to the ranch. The storekeeper's wife, a friendly woman named Mrs. Fletcher, helped Clara choose appropriate materials. "You staying out at Hayes Ranch long?" the woman asked with poorly disguised curiosity. "I'm working for Mr. Hayes," Clara replied carefully. "As his housekeeper." Mrs. Fletcher's eyebrows rose. "First I've heard of Quentin Hayes hiring help for the house. Man's been keeping to himself since he started that ranch." Clara made no response beyond a polite smile, Unwilling to feed the woman's obvious hunger for gossip, as they left the store, Quentin touched her elbow lightly. "I need to see the blacksmith about some work. Why don't you wait at the cafe there? Get yourself something to eat." Clara nodded, feeling oddly bereft as he walked away. In just 2 weeks, she'd grown accustomed to his steady presence. The cafe was nearly empty at mid-morning, with only an elderly man reading a newspaper in the corner. Clara ordered coffee and a slice of pie, savoring the different flavors after weeks of her own cooking. She was nearly finished when the door opened, admitting 3 roughly dressed men who fell silent upon seeing her. Their eyes, reddened from drink despite the early hour, fixed on her with predatory interest. "Well, what have we here?" the tallest one said, approaching her table. "New face in town. Pretty one, too." Clara kept her eyes on her plate. "Excuse me, I was just leaving." "No rush, darlin'," another said, blocking her path as she tried to stand. "We're just being neighborly." The lady said she was leaving. The quiet voice from the doorway drew everyone's attention. Quentin stood there, his posture relaxed but his eyes hard as flint. "Hayes," the tall man acknowledged, taking a step back. "Didn't know she was with you." "She is," Quentin said simply. "And we're done in town." Something in his tone made the men back away without further comment. Clara gathered her parcels and followed Quentin outside, her heart hammering. "Thank you," she said when they reached their horses. "They weren't going to let me leave." Quentin's expression was grim as he helped her mount. "Men like that are why I was hesitant to bring you. Small towns have long memories for scandal, but short ones for bad behavior." They rode in silence for a while, Clara processing the encounter and Quentin lost in his own thoughts. "Is that why you live so far from town?" she eventually asked. To avoid people like that, he considered her question seriously. "Partly. I prefer the quiet. And animals are more straightforward than people." "Don't you get lonely?" The question seemed to surprise him. "Been alone most of my life. Got used to it." "There's a difference between being alone and being lonely," Clara said softly. Quentin glanced at her, something vulnerable flickering briefly in his eyes before his expression composed itself again. "Maybe so." That evening, as Clara prepared dinner, she found herself watching Quentin as he sat at the table cleaning his revolver, a task he performed with methodical precision. His hands, large and calloused from years of ranch work, moved with surprising delicacy over the weapon's mechanisms. "Have you ever had to use that?" she asked. "Against a person, I mean." Quentin's hands stilled momentarily. "Twice. Once to stop a rustler from shooting my neighbor. Once to defend myself from a drunk who took offense to something I never said." His voice was matter of fact, but Clara sensed the weight behind his words. "I'm sorry. That must have been difficult." He reassembled the gun with swift, practiced movements. "It's the way of things out here sometimes. Laws spread thin. Man has to stand his ground." Clara returned to stirring the stew, reflecting on the contradictions of this man who could be so gentle with an injured woman yet carried the weight of having taken lives. "You're different than I expected," she admitted. "How so?" She turned to face him. "When Mr. Blackwell said you'd bought my debt, I thought, well, I've heard stories about women in my position." Quentin's jaw tightened. "Blackwell would think that way. He sees people as property. But you don't." "No." He holstered the cleaned weapon. "My mother taught me better, even in the worst times." Clara served the stew, setting a plate before him. "Tell me about her, your mother." Something in Quentin softened as he spoke of Elizabeth Hayes, her determination to make a life for them after escaping her abusive husband. Her insistence that Quentin learn to read and write even when they barely had food. Her gentle strength that never hardened into bitterness, despite their hardships. "She sounds remarkable," Clara said when he finished. "You must miss her terribly." "Every day," he acknowledged. "But she'd be pleased with what I've built here. She always wanted me to have land of my own." "She'd be proud of the man you've become," Clara said impulsively, then flushed at her own boldness. Quentin looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "What about your mother? You've hardly spoken of her." Clara's fingers twisted in her lap. "She was a music teacher before she fell ill. My father died when I was young, so she raised me alone. She taught piano to support us." A sad smile crossed her face. "She wanted me to marry well to have security she never had. Instead, I'm the one who left, seeking fortune that never materialized." "You were trying to help her," Quentin said quietly. "That shows character." "I failed her," Clara whispered. "I haven't sent a penny home, and she must be worried sick without word from me." "Your letter should have reached her by now," he reminded her, "and you're earning wages here. You can send money with my next supply order." The simple practicality of his solution eased some of her distress. "You're right, thank you." As October arrived, bringing cooler temperatures and spectacular color to the aspen groves on the hillsides, Clara found herself settling into life at Hayes Ranch with unexpected contentment. Her back had healed, leaving only faint scars that Mrs. Ortega assured her would fade with time. She had sewn herself 2 new dresses from the fabric purchased in town, and had grown confident enough on horseback to accompany Quentin on short rides around the property. One crisp morning, as frost glittered on the grass, Quentin approached her as she hung laundry to dry in the bright sunshine. "Need to check the north pasture fence before winter sets in," he said. "Thought you might want to come along. It's a good day for a longer ride." Clara smiled, pleased by the invitation. "I'd like that. Give me a few minutes to finish here." They rode out together, Quentin leading the way up a trail that wound through pine forests and open meadows. Clara had grown to love these mountains, so different from the crowded streets of Boston, with their vast skies and the sweet scent of pine on the breeze. "It's beautiful here," she said as they paused at the top of a rise, looking out over the valley where the ranch nestled below. "So peaceful," Quentin nodded, his eyes scanning the landscape with proprietorial satisfaction. "Winter's harsh, but worth it for days like this." They continued to the north pasture, where Quentin dismounted to inspect and repair sections of fence while Clara held the horses. Watching him work, his movements efficient, his focus complete, she felt a familiar warmth spreading through her chest. It happened more and more often lately, this awareness of him not just as her employer or rescuer, but as a man. "That should hold through the snow," he said finally, remounting his horse. "Let's head back. There's a shortcut through that grove." As they rode through a stand of golden aspen trees, their leaves quivering in the gentle breeze, Clara's mare suddenly shied at a scurrying ground squirrel. Unprepared for the sharp movement, Clara lost her balance and tumbled from the saddle with a startled cry. Quentin was beside her in an instant, dismounting in one fluid motion. "Clara, are you hurt?" It was the first time he'd called her by her given name, she realized distantly as she tried to catch her breath. "Just winded," she managed. His hands were gentle as he helped her sit up, checking for injuries. "Anything broken?" She shook her head, mortified by her fall after weeks of improving her riding skills. "Only my pride." Relief replaced concern on his face, and unexpectedly, he chuckled a warm, rich sound she'd never heard from him before. "Pride heals quicker than bones." The rare smile transformed his features, softening the habitual gravity that marked his expression. Clara found herself staring, transfixed by the change. Quentin seemed to become aware of their proximity at the same moment she did. His smile faded, but his eyes remained on hers, something unspoken passing between them. For a heartbeat, Clara thought he might kiss her. Her breath caught at the possibility, her lips parting slightly in unconscious invitation. Instead, he cleared his throat and helped her to her feet, his touch carefully impersonal. "Can you ride?" he asked, his voice rougher than usual. "Yes," she said, trying to hide her confusion and disappointment. "I'm fine, truly." The ride back to the ranch was quiet, the easy companionship of the morning replaced by a tension Clara didn't know how to break. She replayed the moment in the aspen grove, wondering if she'd imagined the look in his eyes or if he'd truly considered kissing her. And if he had, why had he stopped? That evening, as Clara prepared dinner, the silence between them grew uncomfortable for the first time since her arrival. Quentin sat at the table mending a bridle, his attention focused so intently on the task that it seemed deliberate. "Mr. Hayes," she began hesitantly. "Quentin," he corrected without looking up. "After 6 weeks, I think you can use my given name." "Quentin," she tried again, the name feeling intimate on her tongue. "Have I done something to upset you?" His hand stilled. "No, why would you think that? You've hardly spoken since my fall this morning." He set the bridle aside, finally meeting her eyes. "Just thinking is all." "About what?" He seemed to weigh his response carefully. "About what happens when winter comes." Clara's heart sank. Was he planning to send her away? "I don't understand. Trail to town gets difficult with snow, sometimes impassable for weeks." He gestured toward the window where the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. "Gets isolated up here. Might not be what you're used to, are you? Asking me to leave before the snow comes?" she asked, struggling to keep her voice steady. Surprise flashed across his face. "No. Just making sure you understand what you're in for if you stay." Relief washed over her. "I'm not afraid of isolation or hard work, Quentin. I've come to care for this place." The way his eyes searched her face made her wonder if he heard what she hadn't quite said, that it wasn't just the place she'd come to care for. "Good," he said simply. "Because I've come to rely on you being here." It wasn't a declaration of feeling, not really, but something in his tone made Clara's heart beat faster. She turned back to the stove to hide the flush creeping up her neck, a small smile playing at her lips. As October gave way to November, the first snowfall dusted the mountains. The ranch settled into winter preparations, stacking firewood, smoking meat, preserving the last of the garden's harvest. Clara threw herself into these tasks with enthusiasm, learning from Quentin and occasionally Mrs. Ortega, who visited less frequently as the weather grew colder. One evening, as wind howled outside and snow fell in earnest, Clara sat by the fire darning socks while Quentin read one of his few books. The domesticity of the scene struck her suddenly, how comfortable they had become in each other's presence, how natural it felt to share this space with him. "What are you smiling about?" Quentin asked, looking up from his book. Clara hadn't realized she was smiling. "I was just thinking how different this is from what I expected when I came west. I thought I'd be sending money home by now, perhaps working in a respectable establishment in a growing town." "Disappointed?" he asked, his expression carefully neutral. "No," she said truthfully. "Despite everything that happened at Blackwell's, I'm glad I came. I wouldn't have met you otherwise." The simple honesty of her statement hung in the air between them. Quentin set his book aside, his eyes never leaving her face. "Clara," he began, then paused as if unsure how to continue. The moment was interrupted by a sudden pounding on the door. They both started at the unexpected sound. Visitors were rare even in good weather, and in a snowstorm, nearly unheard of. Quentin rose quickly, one hand moving to the revolver at his hip as he approached the door cautiously. "Who's there?" he called. "Jorge Ortega," came the muffled reply. "Senor Hayes, please, my wife sent me." Quentin opened the door to reveal Mrs. Ortega's husband, snow-covered and shivering. "Jorge, what's happened?" "It's my daughter, Maria. The baby is coming, but something is wrong. The midwife is with another birth in town. My wife remembers the senorita. He looked desperately at Clara, said she had some medical knowledge. Clara stepped forward. I helped my mother nurse the sick in our neighborhood, but I'm not a midwife, Mr. Ortega. Please, the man begged. My wife says the baby is turned wrong. Maria is in such pain. Clara looked at Quentin, who nodded immediately. I'll saddle the horses. Clara, gather whatever supplies you think might help. Within minutes, they were riding through the snowstorm toward the Ortega farm, a small homestead about 3 miles from Quentin's ranch. Clara's mind raced through everything she knew about difficult births, precious little, but perhaps enough to help until proper medical assistance could arrive. The Ortega home was warm but filled with tension. Maria, a young woman of perhaps 19, lay sweating and moaning on a bed, her mother trying to comfort her while clearly at the end of her own resources. Gracias a Dios, Mrs. Ortega exclaimed when she saw Clara. I did not know what else to do. Clara removed her coat and washed her hands thoroughly, trying to project a confidence she didn't feel. How long has she been in labor? Since yesterday morning. The pains are strong, but the baby will not come. Clara examined the young woman as best she could, remembering what she'd learned from the midwife who had sometimes worked with her mother. The baby was indeed positioned poorly. She could feel a shoulder presenting instead of the head. We need to try to turn the baby, she told Mrs. Ortega. I've seen it done once, but I'll need your help. For the next hour, Clara worked carefully, using techniques she'd only observed. Her hands were gentle but firm as she tried to reposition the infant, all while speaking soothingly to the terrified mother. Outside the bedroom, Quentin and Jorge waited anxiously, wincing at Maria's cries of pain. Quentin, Clara called finally, I need your strength. He entered the room hesitantly, his eyes widening at the scene before him. I need you to support her shoulders, Clara instructed, her voice calm despite her inner turmoil. Mrs. Ortega and I need to work together, and Maria needs something to brace against. Without question, Quentin moved to the head of the bed, placing his strong hands on Maria's shoulders. His eyes met Clara's across the laboring woman's body, conveying his trust in her abilities. With renewed determination, Clara continued her efforts. Now, Maria, when the next pain comes, I need you to push with all your strength. The young woman nodded weakly, gathering her remaining energy. When the contraction came, she bore down with a guttural cry, squeezing Quentin's hands so hard her knuckles turned white. Again, Clara encouraged. The baby is turning. 3 more pushes, and suddenly the infant slid into Clara's waiting hands, a tiny blue-tinged form that didn't immediately cry. Turn him over, Mrs. Ortega instructed urgently. Clara did so, clearing the baby's mouth and rubbing its back vigorously. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then the infant gave a gurgling cough and began to wail a thin, indignant cry that was the most beautiful sound Clara had ever heard. A boy, she announced, tears of relief streaming down her face as she wrapped the newborn in a clean cloth and placed him on his mother's chest. A perfect little boy. Mrs. Ortega crossed herself, murmuring prayers of thanksgiving. Maria, exhausted but radiant, cradled her son with trembling hands. Clara turned to find Quentin watching her with an expression of awe that made her breath catch. In that moment, covered in blood and sweat, she felt his admiration like a physical touch. You did it, he said softly. We did it, she corrected, including everyone in the room with her glance. It was God's mercy, not my skill, after ensuring mother and baby were stable and helping Mrs. Ortega clean up. Clara finally allowed herself to acknowledge her exhaustion. Her hands shook as she washed them in the basin. You need rest, Quentin said, coming to stand beside her. It's still snowing heavily. Jorge has offered us shelter for the night. Clara nodded gratefully. The thought of riding back through the storm was beyond her remaining strength. The Ortegas provided them with blankets in the small front room, Jorge and his wife insisting Quentin and Clara take the only spare bed while they kept watch over their daughter and new grandson. "I can sleep on the floor," Quentin offered when they were alone. Clara, too tired to maintain propriety, shook her head. "The bed is big enough for both of us. I trust you, Quentin." In the dim light of a single candle, they lay side by side, not touching but acutely aware of each other's presence. Clara's mind replayed the night's events, still hardly believing the successful outcome. "I was terrified," she admitted in a whisper. "I knew so little, and her life was in my hands." "You didn't show it," Quentin replied, his voice equally soft. "You were magnificent, Clara." She turned her head to find him watching her, his blue eyes reflecting the candlelight. "Thank you for believing I could do it." "I'm beginning to think you can do anything you set your mind to," he said. And there was something in his voice she hadn't heard before, a tenderness that made her heart ache. Exhaustion finally claimed her, and she drifted into sleep with the comforting awareness of Quentin's protective presence beside her. They returned to Hayes Ranch the next morning under clearing skies, the landscape transformed into a glittering white expanse. Clara rode in silence, still processing the profound experience of helping bring a new life into the world. As they approached the cabin, Quentin cleared his throat. "What you did last night, not many would have had the courage." Clara shook her head. "I had no choice. She needed help." "There's always a choice," he countered. "Most would have said it wasn't their concern, or that they didn't know enough to try." "As you had a choice when you saw me at Blackwell's," she said quietly. He met her gaze. "Some choices aren't really choices at all when you know what's right." The days following the birth at the Ortegas brought a shift in Clara and Quentin's relationship, subtle but undeniable. There were lingering glances across the dinner table, fingers brushing when passing objects, conversations that stretched later into the evening. Neither spoke openly of these changes, as if naming them might somehow break the delicate new understanding between them. But Clara felt it in the way Quentin's eyes followed her movements, in the way he found reasons to be near the house when before he would have worked from dawn till dusk with the cattle. A week after the birth, Jorge Ortega arrived with a gift, a handsome calf from his small herd. "For the señorita," he explained as Quentin helped him unload the animal from a small cart. "Maria says her son would not be here without her skill. We can never repay such a debt, but we offer this as a beginning." Clara, touched beyond words, tried to refuse such a valuable gift, but Jorge was insistent. "It is yours to start your own herd if you wish." After he left, Clara stood at the corral fence watching the calf explore its new surroundings. "I've never owned an animal before," she mused. "Not even a cat in Boston." Quentin leaned on the fence beside her, their shoulders nearly touching. "It's a fine heifer, good bloodlines, worth a fair amount. I wouldn't know what to do with her." "Keep her here," he suggested. "Let her grow. In time she'll have calves of her own." Could be the start of something. Clara glanced at him, wondering if they were still talking about the calf. "The start of what?" His eyes held hers. "Whatever you want it to be." That evening, a letter arrived with Jorge's son, who stopped by on his way to another ranch. It bore Boston postmarks and Clara's mother's handwriting. Clara's hands trembled as she opened it, scanning the pages quickly before letting out a cry of relief. "She's better. The doctor found a treatment that's helping, and she received my letter and the money I sent." Quentin smiled at her joy. "Good news, then." "The best." Clara read further, her expression growing more complex. "She wants me to come home." Something shuddered in Quentin's eyes. "I see. She says Boston is where I belong, that I've done my duty but should return to civilization before I become hopelessly provincial." Clara looked up from the letter. She doesn't understand what I've found here. And what's that? He asked carefully. Clara set the letter aside. Purpose, freedom, a place where I'm valued for my abilities, not just my prospects as someone's wife. She hesitated. And people I've come to care for deeply. Quentin took a step closer. Clara, a sudden gust of wind rattled the windows and the lamp flickered, breaking the moment. Quentin moved to secure the shutters against the brewing storm, and Clara folded her letter, tucking it into her pocket. The opportunity for whatever Quentin had been about to say seemed to pass, and they spent the evening in companionable but thoughtful silence, each contemplating futures suddenly uncertain. December arrived with heavy snowfall that isolated the ranch for days at a time. The rhythm of life adjusted to winter's constraints: early mornings breaking ice in water troughs, long evenings by the fire, the constant battle to keep paths clear and animals fed. Clara found unexpected contentment in the season's enforced closeness. She and Quentin developed routines that complemented each other, moving through the small cabin with a harmony that felt increasingly domestic. One evening, as a particularly fierce blizzard howled outside, Quentin returned from the barn with frost clinging to his beard and exhaustion evident in his movements. "Storm's getting worse," he reported, stomping snow from his boots. "Had to bring the weakest calves into the barn." Clara helped him remove his coat, concerned by how cold his hands felt. "You're half frozen. Sit by the fire while I make coffee." He didn't argue, sinking into a chair and extending his hands toward the flames. Clara brought him coffee laced with whiskey, then knelt to remove his boots. "You don't need to do that," he protested. "Your fingers are too numb," she countered practically. "And these need to dry properly or you'll have frostbite tomorrow." As she worked, she became aware of his gaze on her, warm and contemplative. When she looked up, something in his expression made her pulse quicken. "What?" she asked. "Just thinking that I haven't had anyone care for me like this since my mother died," he admitted. "It's nice." Clara set his boots near the fire to dry. "Everyone deserves to be cared for, Quentin." "Even solitary cowboys?" he asked with the hint of a smile. "Especially them," she replied softly. "They're usually the ones who need it most but ask for it least." She rose to check on the stew simmering on the stove, aware of his eyes following her. When she returned with bowls for both of them, he had removed something from his pocket, a small wooden carving of a horse, exquisitely detailed despite its small size. "Made this for you," he said, holding it out. "Been working on it for a while." Clara took the carving, turning it in her hands to admire the craftsmanship. "It's beautiful. It looks like Penny," he nodded. "Thought you might like a reminder of your first horse, whatever you decide about going back east." The mention of her potential departure hung between them. Clara set the carving carefully on the table. "I've been thinking about that," she said slowly. "About what I wrote to my mother." Quentin waited, his expression carefully neutral. "I told her I wasn't coming back to Boston," Clara continued, "at least not permanently. I explained that I've found work that satisfies me, people who value me. I asked her to consider coming west when she's strong enough to travel." Hope flickered across his features. "And if she refuses?" "Then I'll visit her when I can," Clara said firmly. "But my place is here now." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Quentin set his bowl aside, his eyes never leaving her face. "Here at the ranch or here in the territory?" he asked, his voice rough. Clara took a deep breath. "That depends." "On what?" "On whether my employer still needs a housekeeper," she said carefully. "Or if, perhaps, he might consider a different arrangement." Quentin stood slowly, moving to stand before her. "What kind of arrangement did you have in mind, Miss Winters?" Despite the formality of his words, his tone was intimate, sending a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. One that wouldn't require me to sleep in the spare room, she said boldly, her heart pounding. Or you on that uncomfortable chair. His eyes darkened. Clara, if you're suggesting what I think you are, I'm suggesting, she interrupted, stepping closer to him, that I've fallen in love with you, Quentin Hayes, and I hope that you might feel something for me too. For a moment, he remained perfectly still, and Clara feared she'd misread everything. Then his hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch infinitely gentle. Something, he echoed, his voice a low rumble. Clara, I've been fighting how I feel about you since the day you started getting better. Telling myself it wasn't right to think of you that way when you were dependent on me, that you'd be leaving come spring anyway. And now, she whispered, now I'm wondering if I'm still dreaming by the fire, he said with a trace of wonder, because I never thought I'd hear those words from you. It's not a dream, she assured him, reaching up to touch his face in return. I love you. I want to stay. Not as your housekeeper, but as your, he didn't let her finish, closing the last distance between them to capture her lips with his. The kiss was tender at first, almost reverent, but quickly deepened as months of unspoken longing found expression at last. Clara melted into him, her arms winding around his neck as his circled her waist, drawing her closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Quentin rested his forehead against hers. I love you, he murmured. Have for weeks now. Maybe since that day in the aspen grove when you fell and I wished you had, she admitted. Kiss me then, I mean. A smile broke across his face, not the rare, fleeting one she'd glimpsed occasionally, but a full, radiant expression of joy. I'll make up for lost time. He made good on that promise, kissing her again with growing passion until the stew was forgotten and the fire burned low. When they finally separated, both flushed and disheveled, Quentin took her hands in his. Clara Winters, he said solemnly, I'm not a man of many words, but I want to be clear. I'm asking you to marry me, to share my life in this ranch. It won't always be easy, but I swear I'll never treat you with anything but respect and love. Tears sprang to Clara's eyes. Yes, she said simply. Yes, I'll marry you. Later, as they lay together in what had once been only his bed, Quentin held her close, his fingers tracing patterns on her arm. I never thought I'd find this, he confessed into the darkness. After years alone, I'd convinced myself it wasn't meant for me. Clara kissed his chest over his heart. Sometimes the things we need most find us when we're not looking for them. Like a stubborn, brave woman who refuses to stay down when life knocks her flat, he murmured, pressing a kiss to her hair. Or a quiet cowboy with a heart bigger than he lets anyone see, she returned. They married 2 weeks later in Pine Creek's small church, with the Ortegas and their children as witnesses. The winter was harsh, as Quentin had warned, but the isolation only strengthened their bond as they learned the intricate dance of marriage and partnership. Spring brought renewal to the land, and a letter from Boston. Clara's mother had decided to accept her daughter's invitation to visit, with the possibility of staying if the West agreed with her health. Clara spent days preparing for her arrival, nervous and excited to unite the two parts of her life. Catherine Winters arrived in May, a frail but determined woman whose skeptical expression softened visibly when she saw her daughter's happiness and the obvious devotion of her new son-in-law. I must admit, she told Clara as they sat on the porch watching Quentin work with a young horse in the corral, when you wrote that you'd married a rancher, I feared the worst. But he's a good man, isn't he? The best, Clara affirmed, her hand unconsciously moving to her abdomen where the first signs of new life were just beginning to make themselves known, a secret she and Quentin were saving for the right moment. He saved me in every way a person can be saved. Catherine studied her daughter's face. And you saved him too, I think. Clara smiled, watching as Quentin looked up and raised a hand in greeting, his eyes finding hers across the distance with unerring precision. "We saved each other," she said simply. Years later, when their children asked how they met, Quentin would grow quiet, the memory of Clara's wounded back and desperate eyes still painful. Clara would take his hand and tell a story of rescue and healing, of finding strength in unexpected places, and of a love that grew from the harshest of beginnings into something beautiful and enduring. And sometimes, on the anniversary of the day Quentin brought her to Hayes Ranch, they would ride together to the aspen grove where Clara had fallen from her horse and Quentin had almost kissed her. There, surrounded by whispering leaves, they would remember how close they came to missing each other entirely, and give thanks for the cruel twist of fate that ultimately led to their greatest happiness. For Clara, who had once been whipped for being too weak to work, had found not just a place to heal, but a place to belong. And Quentin, the quiet cowboy who had saved her, had found that in saving her, he had also saved himself from a lifetime of solitude. Together, they built something neither had dared to dream of: a family, a legacy, and a love strong enough to weather whatever hardships the untamed West might bring.